Hello, welcome to the video. This is going to be a breakdown of Carl Schmitt's critique of uh, technological change within warfare. This is from Know Most of the Earth. This part I'm going to be reading and discussing. It's from Know Most of the Earth, which is Carl Schmitt's, really big, juicy geopolitical text, where he discusses the creation of international politics, basically, international law specifically. And he discusses this as a specifically European creation, which transformed over time. Um, the historical frame here is a bit complicated, but roughly, I think we could say that it began with a medieval form of international law, which was kind of intertwined into European Christendom. He refers to this as the Res Publica Christiana. And then that later transformed itself into another form of European international law, which was the Jus Publicum Europaeum. Both of these epochs lasted a long time. I won't go into the exact dates, but this then broke down. This Just Publican Europeum, it broke down with World War One and World War Two, basically. And after that, you have this kind of globalist international law, which is reminiscent of the United Nations, first the League of Nations, right, which was an early 20th century institution, and then the United Nations and the World Health Organization, and all these kind of like contemporary, very very recognizable global institutions. This sort of emerged with the United States, and at the end of World War II, and the United States becoming a kind of world hegemon. So Schmitt is kind of critical of this later stage. He has various critiques, which are kind of complicated and hard to get into, but one of those being it's abstract, it's despatialized. It's a despatialized international order. What does that mean? I suppose in simple terms, it means that it's based on abstract morals and laws about how things should or shouldn't be, and it's not based on a fundamentally geographic and spatial perspective, as the older European international orders were, the Jus Publicum Europaeum and the Christian Republic, or the Res Publica Christiana. These were sort of kind of intertwined with it's not simply that they were local to Europe or anything. I'm going to discuss this in more detail, but they were sort of, I would say they were spatially intelligent, right? So this is one of the things we can get from Carl Schmitt's work here, is that modernity, particularly from the 20th century onwards, we can understand in its failures to create stable geopolitical orders, because we've become like spatially retarded, maybe even to put it in a kind of controversial way. We've become spatially stupid. And he critiques modern international law, contemporary international law, well, contemporary for his time, which was like the sort of mid to end of the 20th century, time where he was writing and so forth. He critiques the kind of international law which emerged in the 20th century and has continued into the 21st century in a slightly different way, based off of it being not grounded on spatial concepts, which are intrinsic to what international law actually is. And okay, this is where we can understand this a little bit better by looking at Schmitt's work, Know Most of the Earth. Particularly, I want to focus on the chapter 7, War with Modern Means of Destruction. So we're going to be looking here at like land war, sea war, and then I think maybe in the second video I'm going to do, because I'm probably going to split this into 2 videos, air war. And that these are these spatial paradigms for understanding war help us to understand the history of international relations and help us form a critique of many of the things which now people are very much aware of today, much more than when Schmitt was writing this, such to do with drone strikes, for example. As far as I can see, as far as I can tell, it seems like most of the kind of critiques of like technologization of warfare, particularly from the perspective of incorporating a understanding of space, really kind of begins with Schmitt in his book. As far as I can tell, it's possible that goes back further, but certainly Schmitt was one of the first very, very prominent writers that did this. You could think here of Paul Virilio, of course, the French phenomenologist of speed, who talked about spatial issues, spatial phenomenology and warfare. The other guy whose name I've forgotten, and I'm going to have to quickly Google it. Yeah, okay, found it. It's a French writer, a contemporary writer. I think he's still around, like he's contemporary. Drone Theory by a French writer called Gregoire, and I'm going to say his second name wrong, Shamayu. I'm not sure how to pronounce his second name. You can look on my YouTube channel for much more work on Paul Virilio. I've even done a course on Paul Virilio with Joshua Hansen, who's another Virilio enthusiast. We plan on doing that course again sometime. We haven't got a date planned yet, but it's in the works. And I've also had James Simkin on the channel to talk about Gregoire Shamawa and drone ethics, or drone, I can't remember the title, Politics of Drones, Drone Ethics, whatever it is. So you can look at those. I'll put the links in the description. This form of critique, consciously or not, I think it's fair to say it originates with Schmitt, particularly in this section of Nomos of the Earth. There's one concept which is crucial to understanding in order to understand any of the work Schmitt does in this book, and this is the justus hostis. Justus hostis is, Schmitt likes to use these Latin terms a lot, is just enemy, right? So it's a kind of clever paradox. It's like just enemy. So what do we mean by just enemy? A contemporary person would think an enemy is always unjust. Enemies are bad. This is the kind of way of thinking which, if you had that reaction, just enemy, this sounds like a contradiction. It's a symptom of our time, and it's a symptom of the kind of morality which emerged out of 20th century and 21st century international law that Schmitt is trying to critique. Just enemy is basically the enemy who is not a criminal. Okay, so it was once the case that, at least within the European international law order, okay, this didn't necessarily apply to people outside that order. Okay, so it's not like it's, Schmitt isn't trying to present this like really ethically sound geopolitical system which is like really good, actually. It's not making these like simplistic moral arguments. When it comes to colonialism, for example, outside of Europe, colonialism, although even inside of Europe, I mean, you could say like Ireland, for example, is an ambiguous case here, because did the British treat the Irish in the same way that they treated like their nemesis with like the French or the Prussians or whatever? It's a good question, right? But the excluding colonialism, and excluding, I think it's civil wars and wars of religion, there was a specific mechanism, an international law mechanism, which was in Europe. And you can see this building up over time from the Middle Ages onwards, in which there was a concept of just enemy, and this basically meant that an enemy has the right to be an enemy. It's almost like it's a sporting ethic. It's like your opponent in a combat sport is not a criminal. He's not a morally bad person. He's someone who's trying to win, just like you're trying to win. It's just don't take it personally. you know, this is this is the and of course this came along with various mechanisms, which actually what Schmitt calls bracketed warfare. So it meant things like carrying off a load of slaves, um, uh, like torturing prisoners of war, just outright executing the leaders of um, the losing side of the war. These kinds of things, which if you go back far enough, you do see in like ancient history, you do see this more commonly. Um, these things were bracketed, and war became something of like. I mean, some people say it's like a duel. It's like a duel between two opponents. I think that might be a bit simplifying it because war is never really reducible entirely to a sport. Um, but it is certainly a sporting ethic applied to war. And this was what more or less was being cultivated in Europe for a long time. Two armies would go to battle. The enemy was fighting another enemy. These were like legitimate kingdoms or legitimate states that were fighting over whatever territory or whatever. And they both had a right to fight, basically. And this made it possible to construct peace negotiations after the fact. Now, of course, the peace negotiations for the people to lose are not going to be as good as the peace negotiations for people to win. I mean, it's not like fair in that sense. I mean, it's fair if like it's fair insofar that if you won the war by this ethic, you sort of deserve to have that leading role in enforcing your negotiations upon the other. Clausewitz war is politics by other means. This is very much a Clausewitzian interpretation as well. But at the same time, were we gonna execute people, crazy executions, purges, this kind of thing, taking slaves, torturing prisoners of war for information? No, you were not. A very good example of this ethic actually is in if you read George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia. Very, very actually good book. I really recommend that book because George Orwell fought in the Spanish Civil War, and this is the time when this ethic was breaking down. So, but you still see remnants of it. For example, Orwell will talk about how sometimes when he was on the Republic side, and then Franco's side was the enemy, and when someone from Franco's side would sometimes come over the trenches, come over the battlefield, and sort of surrender to the Republic and say, I surrender. I was just caught up in it. I was a peasant, and they needed soldiers, and we needed some extra money, and whatever. And they were like, okay. And like Orwell said that a lot of the time, at least at the early stages of the war, there were people in the Republic who would just say, okay, no worries. And they wouldn't even they would suspect that they could even be like spies, but they wouldn't even, they didn't know what to do with them. So this was, okay, whatever. Just do whatever you want. Just, whatever. Like, that's kind of forgiving ethic of, you're on one side, you're caught up in a struggle, I'm on the other side. And so there's somewhat a circumstantial component to this. If I was born on that side of the river, I would be on this nation rather than this nation's side. And why am I supposed to just hate people because of that? But at the same time, we still can have war because, like, how else are we gonna have a contest about things like land or whatever? It's a very alien view for our contemporary age, largely because our contemporary age is done by these criminalization. Like war is now a crime, right? If a country declares war, the international community will call that leader a criminal, and they will say you have to be, jailed and overthrown, or maybe even executed. Think of what happened to Gaddafi. I don't think Gaddafi even went to war. Now that I think of it, but look what happened to him anyway. He was just declared a sort of criminal of the international order, just because he had opposing interests, being from North Africa and having opposing interests from the U.S. in particular. And then he was just treated like a criminal because of it, and he was killed in the streets. And this is you actually, like, if you think about the last 20, 30, 40 years, you do see Schmitt's argument here being pretty sound, like ethically not that bad. Like, the criminalization of the enemy is actually something which is very dangerous, because it can lead to an international legal system being weaponized by power structures just in order to say, well, you don't have the same interests as us. You were born on that side of the river, and you don't like that we're pushing you around, so you're going to contest that completely in your right to do so, in my opinion. Oh, you're a criminal, so you deserve to be treated without the possibility of negotiations, without the bracketing. And you even see in Libya. Libya is a great example of this. They opposed, many things that were going on in the West. Their leader was treated as a criminal. He was killed. There was no trial, of course. Not that a trial would even be appropriate in this context, but there was no mechanism of negotiation. And Libya now is a failed state, and there's slavery is back in Libya. So you see how justice hostess is actually a very good way to say, when these conflicts are inevitable and we can't really stop them anyway, why don't we conduct it under terms where we can bracket the worst aspects of it? You can't really do that under the current system. That's the problem. Anyway, let's get into the exact text here. Okay, so Schmitt will discuss the scientific changes and advancements which are now applied to war. He says, natural science today offers any ruler the means of methods to transcend the concept of arms, and thus also of war. Development of modern means of destruction has accompanied and even intensified the transformation of war. Until now, these modern means have moved in two-step with criminalizations. Given our theme, I will limit myself to a few remarks that illuminate the spatial perspective of war in traditional European international law. Okay, continue. So what I was saying earlier, he's taking this from a spatial perspective. So think of all these bourgeois historians that want to go, let's talk about the law that was created in this year. And this year, Mr. King Charles IV made the law that said, don't do this or do that. This is meaningless when it comes to war. At least when it comes to war. Maybe in other areas it has some legitimacy, but when it comes to war, this is just meaningless, right? You have to ground this in spatial realities. Okay, I continue. In the 18th and 19th centuries, European international law achieved a bracketing of war. The opponent in war was recognized as justus hostis and was distinguished from rebels, criminals, and pirates. To the same degree, war lost its criminal character and punitive tendencies, thereby ending this criminalization between a just and an unjust side. Neutrality was able to become a true institution of international law, because the question of the just cause, the justa causa, had become juridically irrelevant for international law. So the just cause argument is something Schmitt also has a lot of critiques about, but we'll probably get into that more in part 2. So European land war had achieved this bracketing. I'll read it. In this way, war was transformed into a relation between mutually and equal and sovereign states. The opponents, recognized on both sides in the same way as justus hostis, squared off against each other on an equal plane. This equality of belligerents, which in the 16th and 17th centuries had been stressed as the equalitas, it's all Latin, my Latin is not good, equalitias hostium by the true founders of European international law, Alberto Gentile and Richard Zausch. It was developed in the 18th and 19th centuries only for European land war. Both civil wars and colonial wars remain outside this bracketing. Only European land wars of this epoch were fought by state-organized armed forces on both sides. So the achievement of this bracketing of war was achieved first by land war states, or if you go back further, you could say kingdoms if in the Middle Ages. But I'm not sure Schmitt would say in the Middle Ages that this full bracketing was achieved. I think maybe this happened in like the 16th, 17th, 18th century. 19th century. But it began earlier than that. Okay. And given the fact that war was fought against enemies rather than against rebels, criminals, or pirates, it was possible to establish numerous legal institutions. So you need the recognition of the just enemy in order to actually create these forms of bracketing. So if an enemy is an enemy, you can say, okay, well, he has a right to be an enemy. This is a contest, and therefore there's a certain set of procedures which come along with that. And if the enemy is a criminal or a pirate, well then, or a rebel, well then these are different categories. These are people that are beyond that legal recognition. They cannot be a just enemy, right? So the just enemy is like, it's not someone, it's like an enemy is not in this context just simply someone who's fighting you, like physically fighting you. It's someone who is kind of understood. Like if someone declares war against us, we have a kind of choice to declare him a just enemy or an unjust enemy. In particular, it became possible to view prisoners of war and the vanquished no longer as objects of punishment or vengeance or as hostages, and no longer to treat private property as war booty, and to conclude peace treaties with self-evident amnesty clauses. Again, so what I said earlier, it makes these procedures which stop war becoming an excuse to just go plunder everything or destroy everything, or or just to treat the defeated enemy like complete slaves. You can do what you want with them. A defeat under justice hostis, a defeated enemy is still granted a certain amount of rights. I mean, they're allowed to claim asylum, for example. There's peace. Like if you go look at Napoleon and the enemies he defeated, he didn't just like execute them and just like he did. It wasn't like this barbarism. Like they were allowed asylum. He would negotiate with them. Sometimes he gave his enemies that he defeated very good terms. Like he let them keep certain lands. He would negotiate with them on certain international treaties and so on and so forth. It wasn't just like, I win, now you're a slave. There was of course there's a power dynamic. I won, so I still get to basically have the last say, and I get to be the louder voice in the room. But it's not the same as the vanquished is just like a slave now. Okay, so let's talk about sea war. So that's land war. Next, we're going to talk about sea war. Sea war is interesting here. Okay. Sea war. Other legal institutions were developed for sea war that also were brought about through humane concerns. But modern sea war did not develop in the manner of land war. According to the rules of sea war, if a warship sank, it was not customary for the leading European countries to hoist a white flag and to treat the vessel as an enemy, as it would a stronghold on land also. So he means an enemy like a just enemy. Also, sea war is recognized generally as trade war or economic war that was not confined to belligerent states, naval forces. Sea war was and remained prize war, and it was directed against hostile and even neutral private property. So sea war is not as regulated as land war. It's not as well bracketed basically. When you get into land war, sea war, it gets a little bit more ambiguous. So prize war refers to the capture of enemy vessels or cargo in conflict that happens on the sea. And there was actually, is what we're going to get into here. There was actually the construction of international institutions to determine what happens to the captured cargo and captured vessels. But anyway, I continue. Sea war was and remained prize war and was directed against hostile and even neutral private property. It was, it was and remained trade war, and trade in the 19th century was considered to be essentially free, i.e. not a political but a rather a private matter. Until the formal abolition of piracy in the 1856 Paris Conference, state-sponsored privateers actively participated in sea wars. To a great extent, the American War of Succession, 1861 to 1865, was still this kind of war, a freebooter war. However, after the abolition of piracy, privateers and their private property remained passive objects of sea war and of prize law. Blockade runners and smugglers, whose property was good prize, were not states but privateers. Neutral trade ships running blockades and taking contraband were not violating neutrality. They were acting within the space of the free sea, the space free of state control, where free, i.e. non-state merchants, had determined that private, i.e. non-state property taken by military action would be considered sea war, thus lacked the complete and consistent equality of both. So you still have a kind of wild openness to the ocean here, in which private actors are able to use force against others in a way in which, in order to take your stuff, in a way in which, or if you there's also instances of and Schmitt does talk about this earlier on in the book of during the British and Spanish conflicts, there was pirates that were hired by the crown, by the state, by the British monarchy, in order to conduct attacks or raids or reprisals or whatever onto the Spanish Navy. And so there's a kind of blurring of the sides here when it comes to the sea. We get a little bit more ambiguous. The sea is seen as a space which is kind of outside of the law, which is reinforced on the land. And you do therefore get more private actors who are not simply like state-backed, regulated, approved, recognized agents who use force, basically. Okay, I'm going to keep reading. Okay, sea war does lack the complete and consistent equality of both, to be the booty or good prize of a warring state. So sea war does lack the complete and consistent equality of both, to be the booty or good prize of a warring state. Okay. Military land war in 19th century Europe had developed into such classical legal institutions as occupatio bellica. On this basis, it had been established that sovereign states at war faced each other as equals and respected each other as such. In sea war, a warship, a component of a state organized sea power, pursued enemy actions directly against privateers, not against equal states and organized powers. Much more could be said about the sovereign state, about privateers in the service of another state, or even about privateers flying their own flag. So, privateers, pirates basically, would sometimes sell their services to one side or the other. They would sometimes just do their own thing. And they sort of occupied this ambiguous space, which there was, there were forms of military contest basically that were happening, but it was unclear, what recognized and legitimate entity that this group of people, the privateers, were part of. Were they part of the state? Were they part of the state's navy? Were they declaring their own nation and so forth? Okay, the privateer of private trade, who either ran blockades or took contrabands, was viewed as an enemy by a warring sea power. But was he a justice hostess? Okay, but what kind of enemy was the pirate in this regard? Okay, so Schmitt says not in the same sense as the equally sovereign state, but also not in the sense of a foe in war of annihilation against criminals and pirates. Okay, so I think he's separating the word privateer from pirate here. I'm sort of using them more as a synonym of one another, but maybe we should separate those out. Okay, annihilation against criminals and pirates. So these privateers occupy a blurry kind of starts to occupy a kind of new category of enemy, not necessarily justice hostess in the complete concrete sense of like one legitimate state military fighting another legitimate state's military, but not entirely as criminals either. Okay, blockade runners and smugglers were not outside international law. They proceeded at their own private risk. Their actions were not legal, but precarious. Sorry, their actions were not illegal, but precarious. They were legal, but they were precarious. Their ventures were possible because both operations, blockade running and smuggling, occurred in principle in the no man's land of a double freedom, i.e., the non-state sphere. The non-state sphere, first, spatially in the sphere of the free sea, and second, substantively in the sphere of free trade. But parties to a sea war, both the state practicing prize law and privateers pursuing trade whose ships or property could become the object of state prize law, appeared before a prize court. So they did have a court for these privateers. It wasn't like there was no international institutional infrastructure to settle disputes over contraband, seized vessels, so on and so forth. And in fact, Schmitt will argue that this specific sort of sea war actually opened up a space for a new stage of international law. Okay. He says, when the specific state character of justice hostis was destroyed, so too was the essence of bracketed land war in international law and all the classical legal institutions. In sea war, it was prize jurisdiction that prevented a corresponding destruction, both in form and in principle. The extraordinary significance of prize jurisdiction in international law lies in the fact that it created the possibility of law and reciprocity with respect to a non-state enemy. Thus, its significance in sea law is fundamental. If it becomes obsolete, then sea law is transformed. Its classical formulation was created by the great prize judges of the Napoleonic age and was developed with full awareness that it was not a national institution of the state, but an international institution of international law. Certainly, the prize judge was commissioned by the national state. However, he was invested not with national, but with international legal tasks and powers. So you see prize law in reconciling these disputes between privateers and disputes about events and conflicts which occur within the free sea. You see here the opening up of a kind of international institution, even though national states may have commissioned appointees to preside over these disputes. There was still they were sort of presiding over a, a sort of nomos, a kind of spatial order, which wasn't really just their national state. They were presiding over something which was outside of their national state. And this kind of helped, we could say, we can speculate, sort of helped create a consciousness of international law as well. And not because of moral arguments or ideological arguments, because of space. Because like what happens in the free sea is the free sea. It's not what happens in, like what happens in the free sea is not something which could be ordered legally in the same way as what happens in the land of a particular kingdom, particular nation, particular city. The spatial context to a conflict, for example, or an action or activity, is very important. It really frames whether or not we call that thing illegal or illegal or legal, or how authorities deal with disputes over that conflict, or punishments over activities that were conducted in that space and so forth. The spatial context here is actually really important. The question of why these spatial contexts are important is crucial here. Schmitt will emphasize a surface. It's a surface. Land is a surface. Sea is a surface. And within these surfaces, war is generally contained to its own sphere. Like on sea, this is before modern means of hypersonic missiles that you can shoot from boats, for example. Like, why is the Black Sea important? Well, it's because whoever controls the Black Sea can basically put ships in there that can shoot hypersonic missiles, either into Russia or into Central Europe or even Western Europe, right? Whoever the Black Sea is, that's why the conflict over Crimea and so forth. It's like whoever owns the Black Sea is able to get their navy, put it in there, and put hypersonic missiles on those boats, and get really close to the other side and just shoot at them. Okay, that's why Russia did not want NATO controlling the Black Sea, because they basically have a giant pond to set their weapons up in. Okay, so you see in our time these, the sort of sea and the land, it's possible for them to fight each other. It's possible to fight people on land from sea and from sea on land. In most of history, that was not possible. You could shoot cannons, from boats onto coastal fortifications, right? In like the 19th century. That's probably the closest that could happen. You could shoot intercontinental missiles like 500 kilometers inland, right? Like from a boat back then. So traditionally, sea and land were much more separated. Sea was sea and land was land. And when sea conflict happened, it happened on sea, and when land conflict happened, it happened on land. So there was a kind of equal surface, right? It's like the battle of, pretty much most major battles happened on land. The Battle of Salamis happened on sea. The Battle of Trafalgar, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, this is all sea battles that just happened, like one side versus another side, and it's all on the sea. Just like the innumerous land battles we can mention just all happen on land. In this context, the surface acts as a kind of playing field. It's a kind of level playing field whereby essentially if you attack, you can also be attacked. I mean, that's really the important thing here. If you attack, if I want to attack you at sea with my 19th or 18th century naval vessel, I have to put myself basically in firing distance of you too. There's a kind of chivalry or a kind of sportsman-like nature to it, which is forced into the spatial reality. If I want to attack you, I have to risk you being able to attack me too. I have to kind of commit myself to a sort of battle zone in order to engage in that conflict. Same thing happens on land. This is basically why, from a spatial perspective, land and sea are able to be given some form of international law. even though they're different in many ways. With air, and this is what we're going to get into next time, is a longer description of air war. Those rules don't apply. The reason they don't apply is because it's not two sides on the same surface. Now it's people on the ground or people on the surface of the sea versus planes who are in the sky. So you no longer have this quality of space, a quality of spatial terrain, we could say. It's a better way to put it. A quality of spatial terrain, a shared terrain. You no longer, with air war, you no longer have a shared terrain. Unless you're talking about air battle versus air battle. Okay, then you're talking, okay, that you have equal terrain. But like air to navy or air to infantry, no, you don't have that. Dropping bombs on people from the sky and then flying off, you don't have the same shared spatial bracketing. And why is that important? Okay, well, I'll describe that in the second video. But that's enough for now. Thank you.